Hello and welcome to Current Affairs on JTV. Our guest today, American political commentator Ben Shapiro, who's currently editor-in-chief of The Daily Wire. Ben, thank you for joining us from California today. I'm going to start by asking a question that's on the mind of a lot of British people, particularly British Jews. Is the Trump administration anti-Semitic? Is it going to be anti-Semitic?
I don't think so. I think that this is a wild exaggeration. I've been a very critical voice about Donald Trump and about Steve Bannon, his White House chief strategist in particular. I don't have any evidence that Steve is anti-Semitic. I don't think that Trump is anti-Semitic. I think that they both are willing to pander to some of the worst people in the world on the alt-right in order to advance their agenda on particular issues. But there's no evidence that Trump is particularly anti-Israel. Bannon, Breitbart has never been an anti-Israel site. It's always been a very pro-Israel site. So, I'm not deeply concerned about anti-Semitism in the Trump administration as much as I am about the emboldenment of anti-Semites through kind of patting on the head more broadly. But as far as policy, no, I don't think that it's going to be I think this will be a far more pro-Israel administration than the Obama administration was, for example.
Okay, well, we'll come back to Donald Trump and Steve Bannon in a moment, but let's just deal with the general, if you like, upsurge of anti-Semitism you were sort of hinting at, particularly on this so-called alt-right movement. What's driving this in America today? We've got things in Europe, as you've probably seen, but the sources of anti-Semitism in Europe appear to be a bit different to what you guys are seeing over in the USA.
So when it comes to the alt-right in the United States, I think the alt-right in the United States is largely a response to identity politics on the left. So the left in the United States has decided to base its politics on multiculturalism and multi-ethnic diversity. The idea being that America is a terrible place for black people, for gay people, for Asian people, for Mexican people, for people of various stripes, and those people can band together and take over the system. And the response has been, from some people, and this is a small group, the response has been racism is bad under any form. It hasn't been that. It's been racism on the left is okay, and therefore racism on the right is sort of okay. And so there's a white nationalist upsurge that's occurred. The alt-right believes that Western civilization is inseparable from European ethnicity in this sense. It's very much like some of the far-right parties in Europe, like Jobbik. There is a neo-Nazi bent to some of the stuff that they say.
But it does appear to be more prominent in America, it seems, at the moment than you're getting in some European countries. Certainly in Britain, you don't see this form of racism.
Well, I think that it's become more prominent in the United States, largely because it's very active in the United States. It's a small group of people. It's still very small, but they've gained added credibility because they have propagators who sort of broaden the definition of what they are. Instead of calling them white nationalists or neo-Nazis, instead what they do is they say that they're the alt-right, and then they redefine the alt-right to include a bunch of people who don't believe this stuff. So some of the folks been guilty of this kind of thing. Milo Yiannopoulos over at Breitbart has done a good job of this, sort of broadening the definition of the alt-right to include people who are mainstream conservatives who just don't like the establishment, for example. And that is a real sin. I think that the conflating the alt-right with people who don't like Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, or Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, that's foolishness. And more than foolishness, I think it's nefarious on the part of some of these folks. Okay,
to bring it back to where we sort of started from, your contention is that, for example, Breitbart and Donald Trump have empowered these people. How's that been the case?
Well, I've been winking at them. As far as Breitbart, Steve Bannon openly acknowledges that Breitbart has become what he called, quote, the platform for the alt-right. In an interview with the Wall Street Journal, he did exactly what I suggested. He sort of broadened the definition of alt-right to include a bunch of people who aren't actually alt-right. Breitbart ran a piece by Yiannopoulos called The Establishment's Guide to the Alt-Right, and that piece explicitly made excuses for this kind of this white ethnocentric philosophy. And that really is quite gross. As far as Trump himself, when he refused to condemn the KKK on Jake Tapper's program, the alt-right saw a wink and a nod there. When Donald Trump makes references to Mexican judges not being able to judge his case, the alt-right sees a wink and a nod there. When alt-right people attack journalists like Julia Joffe for writing critical pieces of Melania Trump, and then Trump says, well, I'm not going to say anything about that, and Melania says the same thing, the alt-right sees a wink and a nod there. If you read the alt-right sites, they basically say Trump isn't one of us, but he's made us feel more comfortable, and he's driven a lot more people to think that we're more legitimate than they otherwise would have. And that is troubling to me, obviously. They become very loud. They obviously are devotees of Trump. They think that Trump is the greatest thing that ever was, at least in terms of mainstream American politics. And anybody who opposes Trump becomes an enemy, particularly if you're Jewish. For me personally, the Anti-Defamation League named me. They did a study and they found that I was the #1 recipient of journalistic anti-Semitism last year, and I'm somebody on the right, right? I mean, I'm very, very conservative, far more conservative than Trump is on every issue, essentially. But that doesn't matter because I opposed Trump, the alt-right. I was the alt-right's enemy, and so I would get literally hundreds and hundreds of tweets a day that were basic anti-Semitic memes, Der Stürmer cartoons, pictures of Jews being shot in the back of the head and the like.
Talk of you going to the ovens, all the rest of it in that way.
Exactly.
Now, let's get back to this point, though, in terms of Trump and the empowerment, how this works. Look, there are many politicians out there who say things that the far right might like. It's one thing to, say that's a definite, nod and a wink. Another, the far right just agree with it. Why do you think Trump is actually giving them a nod and a wink, as opposed to just happening to say things that coincide with what they believe?
No, because he's unapologetic. Because he has retweeted.
But he's unapologetic about everything. There's a man who's unapologetic about everything.
That's it. He's unapologetic. He doesn't feel a sense of shame about any of the things that he does or says, which apparently is a very useful skill in politics. And that means that if he's associated with people on the alt-right, he'll just sort of brush it off as though nothing has happened. It's only in the last week or so that he's really gotten heavy pressure on this and suddenly started to disassociate from the alt-right. Now the alt-right, of course, is disappointed with him. I mean, there was an article today in The Hill saying that Richard Spencer, who's one of the thought leaders of the alt-right, he's disappointed that Trump is trying to disassociate himself. But up till that point, they'd seen him in Trump, not quite a fellow traveler, but somebody who was willing to kind of wink and nod at them if they continue to provide him anti-Hillary memes and treat him as God King. And that's the sort of memery they like. I mean, in terms of the online memes that they push, it's always Donald Trump as an emperor, Donald Trump as a king, Donald Trump as this all-powerful world leader, and Trump likes that kind of stuff. I mean, Trump is somebody who's obsessed with his own ego.
Sure, but at the same time, as you've stated, Donald Trump is not an anti-Semite. So he's going to disappoint these people, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that he's not an anti-Semite, but the thing about Trump is that if you praise him, he's going to be very, very stubborn in not ripping you, right? We've seen that on everything from Vladimir Putin to the alt-right. So the best strategy that anybody can have internationally with Trump is just praise him to the skies, and then he's going to become your best friend. The alt-right did that with Trump very early on, and he resonated to that, obviously.
Okay, you left Breitbart, of course, in rather famous circumstances earlier in the year. But you had, of course, been working under Bannon for 4 years. It took you that long to notice this?
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, the alt-right
4 years
happened really in the last couple of years. So here's my story. I started with Breitbart 2 weeks before Andrew Breitbart, who was the founder of the company, died.
Sure.
And I was part of the central editorial team up until January of 2014. In January 2014, my role shifted at Breitbart, and I was no longer part of any of the editorial decision-making. I wrote basically one piece a day for them, and that was my association with Breitbart. I don't read the comments on stories because if you're in this business, reading comments on stories is a good way to make yourself insane. So I'd heard rumors that the Breitbart comment section had been taken over by sort of this alt-right crowd, but I never perused the comment section because I don't do that. And then, obviously they'd become a very Trump-centric site, which is something I didn't like. But the overt move to sort of ingratiate themselves with the alt-right, that happened after I left. So that establishment piece, the establishment guide to the alt-right that Milo wrote, that happened, I think, the end of March. I left mid-March, and I declared myself anti-Trump beginning of March. So a lot of the sort of overt embrace, that happened late. As far as Steve is not an alt-right guy. Steve's just a guy who's willing to use people that he wants to use in order to get where he wants to go. He's a very power-hungry player. And I think that he operates based on circumstance. If he finds the alt-right to be a liability, he'll dump it by the side of the road. If he finds it to be a benefit, then he'll pander to it.
Okay, so you left Breitbart not because of the alt-right stuff, but because of a disagreement with how the political positioning of the site was going.
Well, kind of. It's fair. I knew where they were on Trump for months, even though people were denying it. But I was sort of the token anti-Trump voice. I mean, I wrote a piece for them, as I say, at the beginning of March, coming out saying that I am not pro-Trump. The reason I left Breitbart, if this was widely publicized, is because there was an incident in which the campaign manager for Donald Trump grabbed a Breitbart reporter by the arm, pulled her hard enough to bruise her arm. When she said something about it, Breitbart attempted to quash what she was saying and then attempted to gaslight her. They said it never happened, it was all a lie, she'd made it up. And she and I both quit at the same time because my basic principle was every publication has its own editorial slant, but I'm not going to work for a publication that treasures its allegiance to a politician above its allegiance to its own reporters. Once you do that, you're talking about a propaganda outfit.
Okay, but you really saw no signs of this. You personally, apart from the sort of the creeping move towards Donald Trump, until sort of March of this year, you saw no signs of this kind of tipping over to a place where you couldn't be.
I didn't know what the alt-right was until this year. I mean, the alt-right was a relatively minor movement. They sort of jacked around online, but
you were getting anti-Semitic tweets already last year, right?
I'm sorry?
You were getting anti-Semitic tweets last year already, didn't just start in March.
No, the anti-Semitic tweets really started for me around February, March. That's really when it began.
When you declared against Trump?
That's when I came out against Trump. When I came out against Trump,
right.
that's when it started to get pretty severe. And then it escalated dramatically after I left Breitbart. And then it escalated even more when Yiannopoulos began pandering to the alt-right and then targeting me on Twitter. That's when that really kind of reached apex.
Now, you and he, of course, have had a famous feud, I think it's fair to say. You're similar ages. You did, of course, write, for a period for the same publication. And both of you are currently, it seems, engaged in outdoing each other on who can be banned from more campuses.
Well, that's not my intent. It may be his. But
I'm sure, but it's interesting that in a sense you're following parallel lines, but in a sense you're also far different in that. What's your critique of him?
I think that Milo's a provocateur with no root ideology other than his own self-aggrandizement. So, if he ends up saying things that I agree with, some things that he says I agree with, then we agree. But his general world philosophy, which has been to kind of boost the alt-right, to treat with the alt-right, to suggest that constitutional conservatism, limited government, these are finished. What we need instead is a broad government, big government nationalism. That's disastrous, I think. And that's we had a public feud on Twitter about explicitly this, and that's when he started directing his followers at me specifically, and to the point where when my second child was born, he tweeted a picture of me of a black child,
yes.
Because the idea in the alt-right world is that if you are not pro-Trump, or if you don't believe in kind of white supremacy, then you are what they call a cuck. A cuck is somebody who likes to see his wife have sex with black men to produce not white children, because this is what you want to do with Western civilization. You want Western civilization to become less white. Milo himself tweeted a picture of me of a black child on the day that my child was born. So I don't give a lot of credibility to Milo as a thinker. I think that he's a provocateur. I think he's relatively quick on his feet. I think the British accent helps, and I wish him nothing but the best.
Of course, but there are people who say, in a sense, you're just jealous of him because he has he's taken what you've done and taken it to the next level.
And most of the people who say that are Milo. So that's okay.
But to look at it another way, there are, of course, people who would regard both of you as beyond the pale, and you've seen the controversy some of your visits to campuses have caused across America. Do you understand why some people would regard you as being, beyond the pale?
Only because they've never listened to anything that I've ever said or read anything I've ever written, considering that I've been banned on campuses from speaking about free speech and about diversity of thought and against racism. And in these speeches, I explicitly rip the alt-right, white ethnocentrism, white superiority, and any concept of it. So, if people think these things, it's because they don't read. It would be very hard to read my material and read Milo's material and come to any conclusions about our similarity.
Well, I know that you're one of the few people who have managed to unite both Black Lives Matter and the alt-right in protests against you.
Yeah, that's right.
When you say people don't read your work as such, do you think you're being labelled as a reactionary conservative? Is that the case?
Yeah, I think that, on campus, certainly.
How would you describe yourself? How would you describe yourself?
Yeah, California State, Los Angeles, there was essentially a riot when I arrived, and professors were telling their students that I was a KKK sympathizer. Okay, KKK sympathizers not only don't wear yarmulkes, but KKK sympathizers don't dump a candidate like Donald Trump, specifically over his failure to smack down the KKK on national TV. It's been bizarre. KKK sympathizers aren't publicly ripped by David Duke by name on his Twitter feed, so it's been a bizarre year.
No, I get all that, Ben, but the fact you wear a yarmulke, the fact that you're Jewish, that does, in a sense, give you a get out from that cry, because
the main get out of jail free card shouldn't be the yarmulke. The main get out of jail card should be the fact that I constantly rip the KKK, and I think they're an evil pile of crap.
Well, absolutely, and I don't think you'll get any disagreement on that score. But there's, there are examples of, some fairly controversial debates you've had. One, for example, over transgender, the case of, I believe you had a bit of a row at one point on screen about the Jenner case in terms of how you regard,
Yeah, I don't know what that has to do with the KKK per se.
Well, no, but what I'm trying to say is, but what do you think transgender is a real thing?
I mean, I don't know what that means. Do I think it's a real thing? I think there are people who suffer from a mental illness and believe that they are members of the opposite sex. I do not believe they are actually members of the opposite sex, because I think that is biologically impossible.
Okay, but you can now see why some people might say that you are espousing views that wouldn't be unsimilar in the KKK. It'd be fair to say the KKK would hold a similar view.
That's insane. I'm sorry. That's plainly insane. If the KKK thinks that the sky is blue, and the sky happens to be blue, that doesn't mean I'm a KKK sympathizer if I say the sky is blue.
I agree with you, but the point is, what I'm trying to get at is, the reason that you are a figure of controversy on some campuses is because some of the positions you happen to hold are shared by extremists.
Okay, and some of the positions that my opponents happen to hold are shared by extremists. I mean, that doesn't mean that the position itself is extreme or that I'm extreme.
No,
Again,
I'm not.
You'd have to actually demonstrate that my philosophy matches their philosophy, or that I've espoused their philosophy, as opposed to publicly ridiculing it, mocking it, and destroying it at every available opportunity, which I've done throughout my career.
And, of course, as you say, your words and indeed your writings reflect that. However, there is a political tone of debate that you've adopted as well in the past when you come to some of the book titles you've had. I mean, to give you an example, the book you wrote about the people versus Barack Obama, the criminal case against the Obama administration. The criminal case against the Obama administration?
Sure, I was making the case that there has been criminal fraud inside the Obama administration, violation of various provisions of federal law regarding arms shipments, violations of IRS neutrality. Yes, I mean, there have been actual crimes committed inside the Obama administration.
Why haven't these been taken up?
Because the DOJ is controlled by the Obama administration.
Do you think they'll be taken up by the Trump administration?
I doubt they'll be taken up by the Trump administration. I have a feeling the Trump administration will be just as political as the holder DOJ was, in a different direction.
So, in other words, the whole of the Washington system, in a sense, is corrupt.
Well, sure. I mean, to a certain extent, yes. I mean, the DOJ chooses what cases it wants to prosecute or not, and some of that is politics. Okay,
let's return to the campus issue. A lot of the things that you go and argue about are about the BDS movement and its fundamental double standards, the way it works. Why is there so much, support for the BDS movement on US campuses today? It seems incredible that in America you can have cases where BDS is being supported across the board in many different universities, where you're getting speakers who get shouted down, people are banned like yourself when you're coming to talk on these subjects. But the other side can bring very extreme people onto campus, and in a sense nobody bats an eye about it. What's going on there? What's the mentality behind that?
The political left in the United States believes that the ultimate value is fairness of outcome. And so when they see somebody in a room and somebody has $5 and another person has $1, they figure the person with $5 must have somehow screwed the person with $1. Well, the same thing holds true in international affairs. They look at Israel, they say Israel is rich and prosperous and free, and look at the people that it's dealing with, the Palestinians, for example, and the Palestinians are poor and repressed, and therefore that must be Israel's fault. Therefore, we have to hold Israel to a standard, and we have to stop doing business with them. And this gives students a feeling of unearned moral superiority. It also means that you're going to end up siding with a lot of the worst people on earth, because a lot of the worst people on earth are poor and living in dire circumstances, specifically because of the philosophies they impose or the choices that they make. So the same campuses that are willing to countenance BDS or are willing to have ex-terrorists, DePaul was willing to have an ex-Palestinian terrorist to DePaul last year, those are the same campuses that will actually send a police force to block me from speaking about BDS, for example.
Okay, so how do you break through that? How do you change the nature of dialogue on campus? How do you make sure views are heard and that bad views, if you like, are, or if you have terrorists actually on campus, they get stopped? What's the way to do that?
Well, I mean, again, my view has always been more speech, not less, is better solution. So
sure.
I'm not arguing for banning people from campus. That would be hypocritical of me. I'm arguing that I should be allowed to speak on campus.
So how do we get you to be able to speak? How does that happen? How does the culture change?
I'm invited by student groups on campus on a regular basis. I mean, I speak on campuses dozens of times a year. Not all campuses are DePaul or Cal State Los Angeles. But the idea is that when people violate those protocols, then you have to confront it, you have to call it out, you have to give it attention, you have to put pressure on the administration. And this is largely successful. I mean, DePaul has already said that they'd be willing to host me at a time of their choosing. We'll keep the pressure on them to actually do that. So, I think that sunlight is the best disinfectant on this sort of thing. And most people don't pay too much attention to campus affairs unless there's actual controversy attached to it. So if I show up and suddenly the police are threatening to arrest me, that sometimes makes a bigger dent in the public consciousness than just a soft policy that they'll allow terrorists but not, anti-BDS Orthodox Jews.
Are Jewish students in America sufficiently activist enough about the problems that they face on campuses?
I don't think so. But I don't think students generally are. I think that there's always a small core group of students who are politically active. And most students on college campus want to go to class and get their grades and go drink and have sex. And, that's the way it works.
But they're normal people. We get that, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So the idea that you're going to have every Jewish student on college campus engaged, I think, is a fantasy. But the ones who are engaged should know how to fight. And there, I think that there's been a bit of a disservice done. I think that there are a lot of students on campus who are under the impression that the best way to fight in favor of their views is to be nice and cordial. And unfortunately, that's not the way it works on campus. I would prefer to be nice and cordial, too. I mean, I've spent my entire life on leftist campuses and in left areas. And I went to UCLA and Harvard Law School. So I'm perfectly willing to have decent conversations with folks at the left. In fact, when I do my speeches on campus, I always say that the only rule is that after I'm done and we do Q&A, all the people who are on the left get to go first in terms of the question line. And if you've ever watched any of my lectures, you'll see that I have very cordial exchanges on a regular basis with left students on campus. But that's not always the way that it works out on campus, and you have to be prepared for option B.
What's the one thing you would say to a non-engaged student that you think could make them into an engaged student?
I mean, I would just say that on a lot of these issues, you are not going to be left alone. You think that you can sort of keep your head down and everybody's just going to ignore you. That only lasts for so long, and it depends on the issue. Some issues, that's probably true. But there are some issues that are going to impact you, and regardless of whether you want to be sucked into them, you're going to be seen a certain way, so you may as well get engaged in the fight. Okay.
As you say, you've engaged a lot of leftists in discussion on this subject, on other subjects, but let's stick to the Israel subject for one moment. I'm curious, what is the argument from the left that has had the most resonance with you on the Israel question? What is the one where you've had some sympathy with, or at least some understanding of? And what was your response to that in order to still knock it back?
Well, I mean, I think that the argument the left makes that is most convincing, and this doesn't say it's a good argument, but it's the most convincing argument, is the argument that, as a bastion of civilization, Israel has higher standards than any of these other countries, and therefore it should be living up to a higher standard. The reason that doesn't work is because you're threatening Israel with consequences, and you really do need to look at Israel's actions in relation to its neighbors. There needs to be a little bit of context that's given. The way that the left tends to act is that Israel is held to a standard. Its enemies, its opponents are held to no standard at all, and that's deserved. And it isn't really deserved. And at the very least, you have to have a baseline of decency before you can start holding everybody to a higher standard.
Okay, so let's look at Israel in the big picture. Of course, we've had this change of administration coming in. You've stated the Obama administration is much likely to be having been worse on Israel than the Trump administration will be. What can we expect? What kind of action can we expect on the Israel sphere from the new administration? Is, for example, Jared Kushner going to negotiate peace between Israel and the Palestinians?
No one is going to negotiate peace between Israel and the Palestinians because it's essentially a religious conflict that is incapable of bridging so long as one side of the conflict is interested in destroying the other side. So, no, Jared Kushner is not the great peacemaker from on high, neither is Trump. The best thing the Trump administration could do would basically be to be hands-off, allow Israel to defend itself, and stop pushing chimeras about peace in a region that's never going to see it. Security is reachable, peace is not. So I think that you will see some movement toward that position by the Trump administration. I'm hoping that the Trump administration will shut down some of the more egregious stupidities at the United Nations, like the idea of unilaterally declaring a Palestinian state. But again, it remains to be seen. Trump is an unpredictable character. His administration is yet to be defined. He obviously is willing to give Vladimir Putin an incredibly free hand in places like Syria. He tends to be more isolationist personally on his foreign policy. So what happens when Israel's interests run up against, for example, Vladimir Putin's interests? Israel's interests run up against the sort of quasi-isolationist foreign policy that Trump espouses. No one really knows the answer to that yet.
Will he move America's embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem?
I think it's highly doubtful. I think he's already started backing away from that one. So that would surprise me greatly.
Although that's not uncommon. I think most presidential candidates promise that and then back away from it. So, in a sense, you're saying the best thing you can do is simply stay away from Israel, not try and create these mantras about peace, give support to the administration. I mean, surely you do give some credit to the Obama administration for the military aid it gave Israel.
Yeah, of course, but that comes from Congress largely, and Obama signs off on it. And Obama did try to delay some of that military aid from the Pentagon in the middle of the Gaza war. So I give him credit for doing the very baseline minimum. I think politically speaking, it would be very difficult for him not to.
So you really give no credit at all to Obama at all for the 8 years in
I think he's been
power.
awful on Israel. I think that there's a reason that he and Prime Minister Netanyahu have such a negative relationship. And that's because Barack Obama does not have Israel's best interests at heart or even Israel's interests at heart.
The ADL, we mentioned them earlier, obviously have criticised Steve Bannon. I know they haven't criticised Keith Ellison.
Yeah, well, the media's left-wing. I mean, the media, Keith Ellison is 10 times as problematic as Bannon. I mean, this is a guy who's a former member of the Nation of Islam. He's hosted anti-Semitic speakers. He's defended anti-Semites like Louis Farrakhan. In 2007, he basically called 9/11 a Reichstag fire on behalf of anti-Islamic forces. He's a very radical fellow, and he's very anti-Israel. He tried to deny funding for Iron Dome, for example, in the middle of the Gaza war. He called on Israel to stop its blockade of Gaza on behalf of Hamas. All of this is disquieting, and one of the more troubling aspects of American politics has been the partisanship about Israel. It seems that the pro-Israel movement has moved into the Republican camp and away from the Democratic camp, and that's the problem. It used to be a bipartisan consensus that Israel was a country worth defending and worth being allied with. The Democrats seem to be moving further and further away from that, and Ellison would just be another move in that direction.
But what I think is concerning is the fact that the ADL, which is supposedly an organisation calling out people like that, not only haven't called him out, but have given him a clean bill of health.
Oh, yeah, it's a joke. I mean, Jonathan Greenblatt, who is a former Obama admin official, I think he was an aide to Obama, it's not any shock that he's backing off of all of this. Again, one of the disturbing things about a lot of American Jewish interest group politics is so much of it is dominated by people who are in close with the Democratic Party, that they're unwilling to stand up to the Democratic Party even when it violates their own mandate. So I wouldn't just name the ADL here. I would say that the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, the AIPAC, I think they did an awful job in pushing against the Iran deal, specifically because they were afraid of ticking off Democrats by forcing them to vote on the thing.
Really? But AIPAC kind of went to the wire on that. They sent people in to lobby.
No, they didn't. They went to war late. They went to war in 2015. They should have gone to war in 2014 when this deal was being negotiated, and they should have forced Democrats to have a floor vote in the Senate on whether this thing would be approved or not. Instead, they basically took a backseat on it.
Which American Jewish organization gets the Ben Shapiro Bill of Health then, clean Bill of Health?
I don't tend to name organizations because I think I know too much about too many of them. All I would say is that I back an organization that takes the right positions on a given issue, but issue to issue it varies. And one of the big problems of knowing any business too closely is that you know all the people who run the various business, and there are a lot of shady characters in any business.
Okay, we've got time for one final question. I'm going to ask you, I hear you do a very mean impression of President-elect Trump. Is this true?
Oh, no, I don't think it's my best impression. I mean, President Trump's that's not my strong one. I do not think that's my strongest impression. But it's not awful, but it's not great. I mean, Chris Matthews is much better. Chris Matthews on MSNBC.
You want to try your Trump on us?
What, the Trump or the Matthews?
Give us a Trump. You can give us a couple if you want. Give us a Trump to start with.
Okay, it's going to be absolutely fantastic, just huge. No matter what you think, I'm going to exceed all possible expectations. And it's okay. It's not great.
Fantastic. Do you want to give the other one as well? Go on.
Oh, Chris Matthews? I wake up in the morning, roll out of bed, come here to the show, come in here to MSNBC. Just like I've been drinking all night. Just come on in and say, I don't have anything prepared. Just come on here, I just talk, and then I talk to Michael Isikoff in Newsweek. It's unbelievable. What say you, Michael Isikoff?
Ben, thank you. Thank you for having answered our questions. Thank you for having given us some of your comedic stylings as well. We appreciate your time, and thank you all at home for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again for another episode of Current Affairs on JTV.